Chapter 8 of the Faith, Power, and Emancipation podcast. Faith, Power, and Emancipation. Episode 9 is based on chapter 8, and chapter 8 is entitled David and Goliath Revisited: Intelligence, Strategy, and Moral Asymmetry. My name is Professor Januarius Asongu. I'm the author of the book as well as the host of this program. In our previous episode, we began part 3, the ethics of liberative resistance, by exploring the moral discipline of nonviolent resistance. We discovered that authentic liberation is not simply about defeating an oppressor, it is about preserving human dignity while resisting injustice. The methods we chose during the struggle shape the society we will eventually build. Today we move to chapter 8, David and Goliath Revisited: Intelligence, Strategy, and Moral Asymmetry. This chapter begins with one of the most famous stories in the Bible. Almost everyone knows the story of David and Goliath. A young shepherd confronts a giant warrior. Against all expectation, David wins. The story has inspired the story has inspired generations because it reminds us that the weak can overcome the strong. But I believe we often misunderstand why David won. Many people think the lesson is simply that faith defeats power. Faith certainly mattered, courage certainly mattered, but that is not the whole story. David also possessed something equally important: strategic intelligence. He refused to fight Goliath on Goliath's terms. That single decision changed everything. Goliath expected a hand to hand combat. David transformed the battlefield. Instead of matching strength with strength, he matched intelligence against arrogance. Instead of accepting the rules established by the stronger opponent, he changed the rules altogether. This is why I believe David's victory is not merely a miracle, it is a lesson in moral strategy. One of the central arguments of this chapter is that struggles for justice are almost always asymmetrical. The oppressed really possess greater military power. They rarely possess greater economic resources. They rarely control the media, the legal system, or the institutions of government. The odds are usually unequal from the beginning. That raises an important ethical question. How should weaker communities pursue justice when they face overwhelming, stronger adversaries? Some conclude that resistance is hopeless. Others conclude that any method becomes acceptable because the struggle is unequal. Liberative realism rejects both conclusions. It refuses passive surrender. It is, but it also refuses the idea that injustice committed by the oppressed somehow becomes morally acceptable. Instead, it asks a different question: how can weaker communities resist wisely, effectively, and ethically? That is where David becomes such an important symbol. David did not imitate Goliath. He did not attempt to become a smaller version of his enemy. He remained himself. He understood his own strength. He understood his opponent's weakness. And most importantly, He understood the nature of the conflict he was actually fighting. That insight remains profoundly relevant today. Many liberation movements fail because they copy the methods of those they oppose. They imitate centralized power, they imitate propaganda, they imitate authoritarian leadership. Eventually, they become almost indistinguishable from the system they originally resisted. History offers many examples. Movements that began with noble aspirations sometimes reproduce new forms of oppression because they adopt the same habits of domination they sought to eliminate. Liberation cannot be built upon imitation of tyranny. It requires a different moral imagination. This chapter therefore introduces another key idea. Strategic intelligence is itself an ethical virtue. Sometimes Christians mistakenly assume that strategy somehow conflicts with faith. The Bible suggests otherwise. Joseph used strategy to preserve Egypt during famine. Nehemiah rebuilt Jerusalem through careful planning. Paul adapted his missionary methods to different cultures. Even Jesus constantly refused to allow his opponents to dictate the terms of engagement. Wisdom has always been part of a faithful discipleship. Liberative realism therefore argues that moral conviction alone is not enough. Justice requires wisdom. Good intentions without good judgment often produce tragic consequences. This is why I draw not only upon Christian theology, but upon thinkers such as Sun Tzu, Carl von Clausewitz, Reinhard Niebuhr, Michael Walzer, etc. Each, in different ways, remind us that political struggle requires careful thinking as well as moral commitment. But liberative realism also insists on something they could not fully provide. Strategy must always remain accountable to morality. Winning is never the only objective. The means matter. The innocent must be protected. Justice must never become revenge. Truth must never become propaganda. Power must never become domination. In this chapter, I identify four qualities of ethical resistance, and we must cultivate those four qualities. The first requires courage. Without courage, injustice remains unchallenged. The second requires prudence. Communities must understand the realities they confront rather than simply reacting emotionally. Third requires moral discipline, which victory achieved through cruelty ultimately corrupts the society that follows. And fourth, it requires epistemic integrity. Resistance must remain grounded in truth rather than ideology, because lasting freedom depends upon an honest understanding of reality. Notice how these four virtues work together. Courage without prudence becomes recklessness. Prudence without courage becomes timidity. Moral discipline without strategic intelligence becomes ineffective idealism. Strategic intelligence without morality becomes manipulation. Liberative realism seeks to hold all four together. This chapter also expands our understanding of power itself. Power is not only military, it is institutional, cultural, economic, and informational. That means resistance must also become multidimensional. Building schools can be an act of resistance. Developing truthful journalism can be an act of resistance. Creating trustworthy institutions can be an act of resistance. Educating future leaders can be an act of resistance. Every investment in truth weakens systems built upon deception. Every investment in justice weakens systems built upon fear. Every investment in moral character strengthens the foundations of freedom. That is why I conclude this chapter by returning once again to David. David's victory did not occur because he became stronger than Goliath. It occurred because he understood the true nature of the conflict. He combined faith and intelligence, courage and wisdom, conviction and discipline. For me, that is the enduring lesson of David and Goliath. The future belongs not necessarily to the strongest, but to those who understand reality most truthfully and act most wisely within it. That insight lies at the heart of liberative realism. Justice requires courage, but lasting freedom also requires intelligence, institutional imagination, and moral integrity. Thank you for joining me for this episode. In the next episode, we are going to explore chapter 9, Cognitive Liberation, where we would examine why modern struggles for justice are increasingly fought through information, ideas, and the battle to shape public consciousness. If you found this discussion to be helpful, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, share it with others, and leave a comment below. And if you would like to explore these ideas in greater detail, consider buying the book Faith, Power, and Emancipation, either from my website, asongubooks.com, or through Amazon. Until next time, may God bless you.